colt. And it is right out of Isaiah chapter 62 and Zechariah chapter 9. The idea of riding in on a donkey, a beast of burden, is a gesture of peace. Now, I've mentioned this before. Jesus will ride again into Jerusalem. He will come riding on a white horse. That is the symbol of a conquering king. There are so many parallels between his first coming and his second, and there's slight variations. This is one of them. He comes on a colt. He is coming as a gesture of peace, and he is still an invading king. So verse 6, oh, by the way, it's interesting to me that well, let's go on and I'll talk about that. The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put on them their cloaks, and he sat on them. And most of the crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. And the crowds that went before him and that followed him were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna in the highest!" And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred up, saying, "Who is this?" And the crowd said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." So this was the beginning of a week where Jerusalem and all of Israel celebrated their rescue from Egypt. It's the Passover. Jesus is riding into town to be the rescuer not just from the tyrant of slavery in Egypt, Pharaoh, but to be a rescuer and the means of rescuing himself from a very different tyrant, Lucifer, who held the people in slavery to sin. Not only would he be Moses coming in and declaring that, "Let my children go," but he would also be the Passover lamb that protected the people from the angel of death. Now, it's interesting to me that the disciples were supposed to make sure, as they went to this village and saw this donkey and this colt tied up, that they would assure the owner that these things would be returned, that they weren't just ripping them off. In those days, you stole an animal like that, it was like Grand Theft Auto, right? The little donkeys had LoJack on them and the whole thing, and so, no, not really. If you don't know what I mean, then don't worry about it. But it was a serious thing. Stealing an animal like that, very serious crime. And so Jesus is concerned about how the owner of the animal will think. I think that's interesting because, a king, the kind of kings that they had, they just came and took it. King wants it. Deal with it. But Jesus considers the things that people give for his service. And so they begin to ride in, and the people begin to lay their cloaks on the road. Now, this was not just because they were warm. This was very symbolic, very significant, and it comes out of 2 Kings chapter 9. When Jehu was declared to be king of Israel, they laid their cloaks down in front of him. So the people, this is not lost on the people. They might not have really understood what they were doing really clearly and all that, but they were kind of caught up in this moment. And as we talked about on Palm Sunday, this was probably one of the most significant events in God's prophetic calendar, because from the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, which is what we're studying in Nehemiah, to this very day, there was an exact count of the number of days in between. And so if somebody had a calendar, they could literally have looked forward and said, "Oh, you know what? I've got something on my Google Calendar today that tells me that the coming of Messiah the Prince is today." And so they would have turned out. Well, the people did turn out. And they're caught up in this thing that's going on as they lay the cloaks down, and they're saying very significant words. When they say, "Hosanna in the highest," and the Son of David, they're quoting Messianic Psalms, and they are proclaiming Jesus as the rescuer, the anointed one, the Messiah who's coming. Now, I find it interesting that it says most of the people, because as in any situation like that, not everybody's going to hear, not everybody's going to respond. But most of the people laid their cloaks down, and they were waving fig and olive and palm branches, and they were laying them down on the road. It was an incredible, incredible scene. So much so, it says that all of Jerusalem was stirred up. Who is this guy? And the people said, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee." Now, though they don't really understand the full purpose for Jesus coming, He is not coming as a nationalistic leader to rescue them from Rome. That's really what they were looking for. He was coming as a sacrificial lamb to liberate them from sin and from this religious system that had made this kind of crust of fake righteousness, that really what it did is it formed a scab that kept people from being able to come to God. So then in verse 12, so He comes into Jerusalem, and Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. And He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers." This is the second time that Jesus has come and done this in the temple. And His first stop in His takeover, really, His retaking of His land and His palace. Now, Jewish males were supposed to come to Jerusalem 3 times a year for these special feasts, and one of them was the Feast of Passover. They were supposed to offer as a sacrifice a lamb without blemish from their own flock, part of the prefiguring of the Lamb of God who was without blemish and was offered as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. Well, people came from all over, sometimes long distances, and people began to realize that this is really hard to transport one of my little lambs all the way from my house. And so in the course of time, as a public service, I'm sure, the religious leaders set up 4 marketplaces on the Mount of Olives for the people to come, and instead of bringing a lamb, they brought money. And that money would purchase a lamb without blemish, at least no matter what. If they bought it from the market, the priests would look at it and say, "Oh, there's no blemish here because it's got my stamp on it." So the people would buy these lambs, or if they were poor, a pigeon, and they would come into the temple and the sacrifice would be made. Well, somehow, again, over the course of time, people started thinking that, well, that's kind of inconvenient. Wouldn't it be great if we had one-stop shopping? If we could just come into the courtyard of the temple and we could buy whatever we needed right there. And we also need to pay our tithes, but most of us are coming in with Roman drachmas. Drachmas had the image of Caesar on them, and that would have been idolatrous to the people of Israel. And so they had to change them into Jewish shekels. And so they thought, well, you know, we should offer that as a service as well. And we think it's so altruistic, and they're really helping the people out. But really, that's not what it was about at all. What they were really doing was making a huge profit. And not only that, but where they set these markets up was in the court of the Gentiles, the outermost